So my name's Kylie, and I feel like I've taken a scattergun approach to having my son diagnosed. Basically, the doctor gave me a piece of paper and said, okay, goodbye. And I was left on my own. I've had separate assessments with the OT, with the speeches, and it's all over the place. And I have to deal with the NDIS, negotiating, planning, and I feel completely overwhelmed. If some of this resonates with you, well, then you're definitely in the right place today. My name is Nicole Gamarov, and I'm the founder of MyCareSpace, an online platform that creates meaningful connections for people with a disability so they can build an extraordinary life. This is our first in a series of webinars, and we're delighted that you can join us. We've been swamped by the response and the number of questions. So to that point, we will try and answer as many questions during the webinar today. Both Charmaine and Randa will be answering questions, but we have limited time, so we will not be able to answer all 200 questions. So over to the panelists. So I'd like to just make a brief introduction. So we have sitting with me here is Randa Habelrih.
Hi.
Who's an international award-winning speaker, autism activist, and author. Randa's also been a marketing executive, and she has worked with some of the largest global brands, luxury brands. Randa has also written a book called Dealing with Autism, and Randa has also created a program called Schoolmates to prevent bullying in school. Randa holds a Bachelor of Commerce and is the mother of 2 children, one of which is on the autism spectrum. Something quirky about Randa, Randa says she is allergic to wine, but she loves a good scotch. Randa can be found on www.randahabelrih.com, and she also has a Facebook group called
Autism Connection on the Spectrum. Come and join us.
We will provide links for all this relevant information afterwards. Over to Charmaine. So Charmaine is a support coordinator and a peer mentor for people in the NDIS. Charmaine is also a trainer for parents and professionals dealing with autism. Charmaine has a Bachelor of Behavioral Studies in psychology, and also happens to be the mother of 2 children, the oldest of which is on the autism spectrum. Something quirky about Charmaine is that she was a ballroom dancer.
I didn't know that, Charmaine.
I keep it secret.
Not anymore.
So in terms of Charmaine's Facebook profile, hers is private, but she has been very generous in providing a long list of useful links, which we will email to everybody after the webinar. So no need to write all those useful links down. So onto the meaty part of our discussion today. We have split the webinar into 3 key sections based on the number and the nature of the questions that have been sent through. So the first one is NDIS access and eligibility. The second section is planning for the NDIS. And the third section is how do I get the most out of my NDIS? So we're going to kick off the first discussion, which is NDIS eligibility and access, with a question that we received from a mother. And this is, I'm going to pose this to you, Charmaine.
Yep.
Mum says, I've been using HICWA funding for my 3-year-old daughter. Will she automatically register for NDIS? And what happens if my HICWA funding runs out before I get NDIS approved?
Okay, so all the acronyms already starting off. So I'm going to do my best to try and explain those. So HACWA stands for Helping Children with Autism, and it's the prevailing funding that's been in since 2008. So for anybody who's got a child that's either under the age of 7 or might have received it in the past, Helping Children with Autism funding will transition to NDIS. So the simple answer to this person is, will she automatically register for the NDIS? The answer is yes. The Australian government is aware of people who are receiving current funding, and it will then trigger the NDIS to contact her to transition. What happens if your NDIS or your HACWA funding runs out before your NDIS gets approved? Well, this is the nature of individualised funding. There will be a gap, but the NDIS will take over. And I guess, and I know you're going to keep me to time here, but really there's another broader point here, which is the Helping Children with Autism funding signifies and represents the old style of funding, the funding that would be used up. It's either, it's rationed in some way, time limited, dollar limited, up to a certain age. And really when you transition to the NDIS, it's a new style of individualised funding. The NDIS fund what's reasonable and necessary, and they're two words that you'll probably hear me say a few times during this webinar, and they're for as long as required. So I hope that kind of starts to answer, to reassure this parent that yes, that the funding will transition across. And actually I've got a great link where the Department of Social Services kind of step through every question that you could ask about that transition. So I'll make sure that's in my notes for you.
Great. Thanks, Charmaine. So I guess in terms of NDIS eligibility and access, where do people start? Because a lot of people who actually registered for our webinar, I'd say about most of them, probably 90% don't have their NDIS plan yet. So a lot of people are in that sort of early stages of trying to find out about the access and eligibility.
All right, so what are Randa and I going to say? It's a bit like when everybody's in the swimming pool going, come on in, it's lovely, and you're kind of standing on the end going, I don't know. I mean, I was incredibly anxious about getting into the NDIS. The application form sat on my sideboard, but I really do believe that you're better in than out. So let's just talk a little bit about the pathways. And again, I've given you links to these documents. There's essentially two pathways into the NDIS. There's those who have a child under the age of 6, and that's called the Early Childhood Early Intervention Pathway. That's ECEI. So you'll notice some of my resources specifically use that acronym ECEI. And it was developed in response to the fact that people with very young children often don't have all of that, the documents, they don't have all of the reports. So they created a pathway into the NDIS that has wider gateways. It's a softer entry, and there's apparently an early childhood access partner just waiting to pick you up and kind of smooth your entry into the scheme. For those who are over the age of 7, then you go through the standard pathway, and I've given you a link to the NDIS My Pathway document. And essentially the eligibility is that you meet the age requirements, and the only age requirement is that you're under the age of 65, because over the age of 65 you're captured by the aged care system. So the NDIS is under the age of 65, that you meet residency requirements, and that's either that you're an Australian citizen or a permanent resident, and that you meet the disability criteria. And I think that's the one that perhaps hits home the most for either people with autism or somebody who loves and cares for somebody with autism. So we might talk a little bit about that, about the diagnostic criteria. So first thing I can share with you is you probably need to know what level of autism your loved one has. And that's really going to come from the latest diagnostic criteria. So the autism is diagnosed in accordance with the criteria set down in what they call the DSM-5, and that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition. And that sets out the various features of autism under 2 broad categories of social communication and behaviour. And there's a number of different diagnostic tools that might be used, including things like the ADOS or the GARS. I think back in the day, my son did the autism diagnostic interview, and they can then say you or your loved one has autism level 1, 2, or 3. And they can be described as autism level 1 requires support, autism level 2 requires substantial support, and autism level 3 requires very substantial support. And these levels are important because the NDIS provides automatic access, no more assessments required, to people who are autism level 2 or level 3. Now, it doesn't slam the door in the face of those with autism level 1, but by the time, and I've given you a few links to these, I don't expect people to remember it, but it's in my useful links, that if you have autism, or you or your loved one have autism level 1, then we really go down a little bit deeper into a few more of the kind of underpinning principles of the NDIS, which is it's not just diagnosis, it's functional capacity. So if you have autism level 1, you need to be looking at the areas of functional capacity that they'll be looking at is mobility, communication, social interaction, learning, self-care, and self-management. So I've given people some links to understanding the diagnostic criteria and then understanding the eligibility criteria for the NDIS as it relates to autism diagnosis. Does that help?
Definitely. I mean, in terms of Randa, I mean, you've been through that process, so can you relate to that?
We've just been through it because we had our planning meeting and we were given the heads up that we really do need a DSM-5 diagnosis. Now, Richard being 21, didn't have a DSM-5 diagnosis, so we then had to go and get one. So don't wait until you're given the planning date to organise this, because when I started ringing around, I was given 3-month waiting periods to be seen. Luckily, we were able to be seen and to get a report tabled, but get that DSM-5 diagnosis as soon as possible. And that way you'll know if your child is diagnosed with level 1, you need further reporting and further substantiation. But definitely go and do that as soon as possible. But also, if you do have a diagnosis of level 2 or 3, again, that doesn't mean a carte blanche of everything you want. You still need the supporting documentation. It's very important to know what you want to ask for. Document that in NDIS speak or terminology so that it relates to your goals. And then have the supporting documentation, whether it's from the allied healthcare professionals, your OTs, your speechies, your psychologists, and also if your child is post-school, have some sort of connection with the employment service that you are after. Now, we were caught out with that. We had to do some backtracking, and now we have the report required or some statement from the service that we're working with a quote with what Richard needs and what his supports will be. So everything must be supported. Yes, ask for everything, make a big wish list, but use your NDIS speak and have every supporting documentation ready. They do not accept any document that is over 2 years old. I went in with a mountain of paperwork and it was just pushed aside if it was more than 2 years old. So that's also very important to remember. They don't care about the initial diagnosis. They want 2 years and under.
Mm-hmm. All right. And can I conclude access requirements with the first time I'm going to mention that every decision that the NDIS makes, almost every decision, is a reviewable decision. So if you apply, you or a loved one apply to be a participant of the NDIS and they say no, or they say we don't have enough information, that decision can be reviewed. And in the links, I've given you the link to a reviewable decision, and actually some people have taken it all the way to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal about either being accepted as a participant or not. So it's not even the last say. Just because the NDIS say no, if you feel that you or your loved one should be a participant of the NDIS, then you can review that.
And Charmaine, in terms of having a review, I've heard some people say, well, it's better to just wait till your next plan. What's the view on that? Do you go for a review or don't you? And how demanding is it to go through that process?
All right, so I'm going to talk about reviews as they relate to funded supports a little bit later in our getting your plan. This is purely about getting in the front door. If this is about whether you meet eligibility criteria or not, and you're knocked back at the first swing, then that decision can be reviewed.
Okay.
All the further, discussion about reviews, we'll talk about that when we talk about funded supports, if that's okay.
But really, to wrap it up, for a lot of people, the question was, I have ASD1 or I have a child ASD1. It's not automatic. You have to then go through those extra hoops and functional assessments.
Yeah, so I have put it in the links, just exactly what the wording is that the NDIS use. They say permanent impairment and functional capacity, no further assessment required for ASD level 1 or level 2. But then they say if your condition is not on the list of permanent impairment functional capacity, you must provide evidence of the impact of your condition on your life, including those 6 domains of functional capacity, communication, self-care, self-management. So for those for whom that is the most important deal, I've given you some useful links.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Now, any questions that that you think we received that might be relevant in this section around eligibility and access?
No, but I think we've got another question that might segue us onto the next section, which was about respite. Did you want to ask that one?
Yeah. So we received a question from a parent saying, why is respite for carers not recognised as a need?
Right, so I've got good news, and that is that respite's in the NDIS. It's just couched in a different way. So firstly, my good news is it comes in the NDIS in the form of what they call short-term accommodation. And actually, this the crisis in respite and short-term accommodation really came to a head in October, and new prices were released. It's unprecedented that, there's usually a new price guide every financial year, but they had to rush out a change in prices to prop up respite providers because the pricing was completely inadequate. So this is on page, and I'm going to give you the link to the price guide. On page 42 and 43, it talks about this short-term accommodation, which is the new word for respite. And Randa really nailed it when she said there's this NDIS speak, there's this language. And that really harks back to the philosophy that underpins the scheme. So we used to talk about respite, and that was really centered around the fact that it's hard to be a parent, that there's a lot of stress, and that parents need a break from their caring responsibilities. That's where respite kind of came from. But actually the NDIS is person-centered. It puts a person with a disability at the centre of their planning conversation. So rather than saying parents need respite, it will frame it that that person who has a disability can have an opportunity to live independently with the support that they need. The byproduct of that might be that parents get a break, but the intention of it is actually something that's good for the participant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it might not be what people want to hear, but really, we're not here to change the policy or to change these things. We're here to understand them and how do you work with them. So if parents understand that aspect, Randa, what about your experience?
We're accessing the respite service that we used to access pre-NDIS under the NDIS. And how we framed it was that our son would like to go out without his parents present all the time. He's over going out with mum and dad. He's a young man, he's 21, and he wants to go out with his peers, with friends, with other people. So while we're still accessing a respite service under the plan, it's community participation or socialization skills. So it's back to becoming aware of the language you use when you're sitting down with your planner, and really not a lot has changed in that regard. They used to be called a respite service, and now they've dropped that part of their name, but they're still operating. And as I said, nothing's changed, only the words in how we applied for this particular funding.
Great. So Randa, one of the questions we got from a parent was their first experience with NDIS funding and what to do. So you've answered that to some extent. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to that? So you spoke about, I think, very important to know that your assessments and your health professional input cannot be older than 2 years. And we've spoken about the DSM-5. Are there any other learnings from your transitioning of Richard in that first sort of eligibility and access phase that might help other parents going through?
Well, just in terms of appeals, we have started we've activated our NDIS plan, but there is a part that we want reviewed, and that's ongoing as we have already activated our plan. So it's not the be-all and end-all if you don't get every part of what you've asked for. We're reviewing that particular part of it. So just keep going, and just remember it is a one-year plan, and you get another go in a year's time. But in the meantime, you can still appeal a particular decision, which is what we're currently doing. And we can shift funds around, particularly since we're self-managed. Now, if it is an option for you to self-manage, that will certainly stretch the dollars further. And it also gives you the flexibility in employing your own support workers and really picking and choosing who you wish to be a part of your child's development rather than being tied to certain service providers who have to stick by the NDIS price guide. This way you can employ them under your terms, and they pretty much work for you and your child. Okay,
and we'll probably talk about that in more detail under getting the most out of your plan. Charmaine, would you like to add something?
I'll always jump in. Look, I probably didn't prepare well for Jack's first planning meeting, so I've learnt deductively. I've provided, again, some links to some fabulous planning tools. You know, the work that you do in preparation can really help you to understand what the NDIS can offer, to bring in the things that you need to discuss, because it's quite a different way of determining what will go into the plan. And you kind of fill your whole life story, and then that falls into different funding categories. So I've given links to, I think one of the best ones for young children is by the Association for Children with a Disability. There's also a good link to the one by Every Australian Counts. I actually Googled, you could, and you probably still can, go to pre-planning courses, places like Yetta Institute, and this was like a 48-page planning document. So I've given you links to those. With regard to, so imagine that you've got this document, you've got all the assessments that Randa spoke about, you might even have quotes or a wish list. You'll need to develop goals and aspirations. And I think that I really got caught out. They said, what are your goals and aspirations? I remember thinking, well, I don't know. I mean, I've been very much in the therapy environment. We had targets and drills, but as for kind of broader life goals and aspirations, I was a bit lost. It took me a while to kind of work out what that was all about, but very much funded supports are about helping you reach your goals and aspirations. So use those planning documents that I've given you links to help you to write good goals, because I think everything kind of hangs under that. Be ready for the planning meeting. You'll get asked.
We jumped in, so we've started the planning for the NDIS meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Right, okay, so just so that everyone's with us, if any new people have joined, we're now talking about planning for the NDIS. So we're at the stage now, just to revisit, that we're eligible and we've confirmed access. How do we actually find out that we're eligible and have access? Just when do we receive that confirmation? Is it an email or is it a letter in the post?
I'm not sure. Randa would know. I mean, Jack joined the scheme 4 years ago in trial phase. We dropped a form in and somehow magically must have got some kind of word back. But what happened, Randa?
You receive a letter.
Okay, snail mail, normal, like old-fashioned.
Yes, that's right. If you're already accessing services and you're in the system, there are many for whom participation is automatic, but you will still get a letter confirming whether you apply, whether you don't apply. You will get that letter telling you.
Okay.
And then it gives you the phone numbers to phone if you disagree with the letter. If you're rejected, then you're given the details of how to follow up.
Okay. And presumably a lot of the feedback we get is we haven't heard, we're still waiting. So I think there's an element of you do need to be patient, but at some point you also need to follow up. Letters go missing.
Absolutely.
And what's your advice there?
I was on the phone daily for about 3 months.
Okay.
I am not exaggerating, daily. And they document every phone call, particularly if you insist that they do and you ask them to read it out to you. So you must, if you think you've fallen through the cracks, if you think they're dragging the chain, the reason I did this because in my area, everybody I knew was well and truly on their way. if your area hasn't rolled out, there's no point phoning. But if it's rolled out and everybody that you know is already involved, it's time to start. And I don't know what happened, but we did fall through the cracks, and it was the persistence that finally got some attention. And we were told that they tried to call, but I didn't answer, which is a load of nonsense. But you do follow up if you think you should be at a particular stage. Yeah.
Okay, all right, great.
So yes. I can say, if people are not sure whether the NDIS is in their area, there's a couple of links that I've given you. You can go onto the main NDIS website and you can click down under, I think it's participants, and you can go in state by state about where it's rolled out and where it hasn't. And then I've also given you links to the New South Wales NDIS website, the Victorian one and the Queensland one. You can almost put your postcode in and see when it'll come to your area. So, and look, the only other thing is, just remember, this is a numbers game. 460,000 Australians will become participants in the NDIS, and while there was a slow start during trial phase, those doors have opened and there's floods of people coming in. Yes. So, you know, if you meet the eligibility requirements, there is a place for you in the NDIS. It's a bit like kind of squeezing into a packed peak hour train. You've just got to kind of grapple with that. It's very tight timeframes at the moment for rollout.
And we do need to remind people that this is the single largest policy change that Australia has ever undertaken aside from Medicare. So we're taking all our state-based schemes and we're combining them into one national scheme. It's never happened before anywhere else in the world. It's the first time. So there are teething problems, but we do believe that they will be overcome. So let's hop into the second part of our webinar, which is planning for the NDIS. Now, a lot of people are terrified about that first plan meeting. They understand that it's potentially make or break. I've spoken to local area coordinators and they say, look, remind people autism is a lifetime, whereas your plan is for 1 year, 12 months. That's fine. But Charmaine, share with us a little bit about planning. How can we plan for the NDIS meeting and that first plan?
Yeah, well, do what I say, not what I did, because I really wasn't. I guess that's why I feel so passionate talking about the NDIS, because I feel very much that I was in the same shoes as everyone who's watching this. It was daunting. I didn't know what the scheme could pay for. I didn't know what to ask for. I use this analogy. It's like going into a restaurant where there's no menu. You know they sell food, but they won't tell you what you can order. You just have to kind of tell them your whole life story, and then they'll magically create this plan and you've got to eat it. So I feel like now that I've walked that path, I can say, hey, by the way, this is the process. So yeah, definitely do some pre-planning, complete some of those pre-planning documents. Understand that the planning meeting is likely to be based on one of two questionnaires. If you've got a child, they'll probably be asking you questions in accordance with what's called the PEDICAT. That's PEDICAT. It's an assessment that helps to determine functional capacity and perhaps then deduce towards what funded supports you might be eligible for. Or if you're an adult, it'll be the WHODAS, World Health Organization Disability Assessment Scale. I've given you links to those in my notes. That'll just help you to understand why you can ask these questions that you have to rate on a Likert scale, and I don't know, I get very confused by those things. I've also given you a link to my story of going in for the planning meeting with Jack, so you can click on that link. But actually one of the other links that I've given you are some top 10 tips for planning that were prepared by Every Australian Counts. So of them, things like, you know, write a list, think big, be specific, learn the language, which Randa's already mentioned, do research, you know, take paperwork. And then the other one, the last point of theirs is take someone with you. And if there was one thing that I would say as a parent of a child with autism, any meeting you go to, take someone with you. Because I think that people react very differently when they've got you alone in a room as they do when there's somebody watching them. So there are my tips. And I've also given a couple of my big heavy duty links to some heavy duty documents. And the heavy duty documents are the ASD evidence-based and informed good practice. It is, I'm not kidding, an 80-page document. But buried within it on page 11 it talks about what's best practice for autism. So for those who might be watching this webinar who are very interested in getting intensity in their early intervention funded, there's specific wording in there that starts to land on the programs that have been evaluated, what's effective for treating autism, and intensity in hours. So that's in the links. And the other one is the interface, COAG, which is the Cooperation of Australian Governments. I've got my acronyms right. Way before the NDIS was born, all of the different areas of government sat down and had a little card game and determined who would be responsible for what. So people think that the NDIS has come into being and it's just going to solve all of the disability, all the problems that you could possibly have with disability. But there's very clear borders to the NDIS, and they're called the interface. And the most common interface that we bump into when we've got young kids with autism is the interface with the school system. And now the school system may be treating our children well or not, but there's a really clear set of rules about what the NDIS will pay for and what the school system has to pay for. The other one that we have a common interface with is health. How much should we expect the health system to do and what should the NDIS do? And actually, lots of people get caught up spinning their wheels, expecting the NDIS to pay for something and then finding that it doesn't, getting really disenchanted. But actually, there's a document that sets out who's meant to pay for what. So if you can follow the link, get into that, find out the interface that impacts on your family, your loved one the most, that can kind of help you to avoid some of those conversations where the NDIS might say, oh, we don't pay for that, or we don't fund that. That's the responsibility of another service system.
So is it similar with health? So a lot of the questions we've been asked is, right, I need to get all these assessments. Some of these assessments are really expensive. Who pays for those sorts of assessments when you're in the planning process?
That's a really good question. At this stage, the NDIS don't fund diagnosis. Diagnosis is definitely within the health system. Assessments to prepare for the NDIS planning, well, the NDIS only pays for things once you're in, so that would still either be out of pocket or somehow covered within perhaps Medicare item codes, perhaps private health funds. I mean, autism is an expensive business, and Randa even just mentioned waiting lists. It can even be that you have to wait to get into the paediatrician. But also, I think, one of the things that I've provided in the links is who can do this, who can provide an autism diagnosis. And it comes down to that it's, just check, that it's either a multidisciplinary team. So sometimes you could get those through local councils or the government or the health system. Paediatricians, they're always going to be covered by the health system. Psychiatrists, the health system. Clinical psychologists, and that's where you might need to get things like a better outcomes for mental health plan or a team care arrangement by your GP to give you referrals on to get the assessments done before you get into the NDIS. It's a tricky thing, and actually you really pointed out a gap. There is a gap, and there are many gaps.
Yes, and unfortunately you have to pay for that gap.
Okay, out of pocket. That was your experience?
Yes. It's always been our experience, especially if you don't want to join an 8-month waiting list, and that's not an exaggeration. So the 3-month waiting list I was referring to was for private practitioners.
Yeah, I have heard one more story, which is if you really do go into the NDIS with nothing, no assessments, no recommendations that can help a planner, well, then your first plan might be funding your assessments.
Right.
You think, oh, great. But then that's your first plan.
Yes.
So really what you've done is deferred your entry until the assessments come through. So I have heard that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, not sure.
Okay. So one of the questions that we had, and that's probably relevant to this planning phase, because we know you've got to go in there and you've got to think about your goals and you've got to think about your supports for an ordinary life. But what happens, and Charmaine, this is for you, does the NDIS acknowledge the difficulty of having more than one child with ASD? So, and how do you manage that where you've got maybe 2 or 3 children that are on the spectrum? So how does the NDIS face that issue?
Look, they do acknowledge it, and what we would know is that having more than one child with an autism spectrum disorder. So I look after participants as a support coordinator. I've got some participants who have 2 children with autism. I've got one that's got 3, I've got one that's got 4, and the most I know is a participant that's got 6 children with autism spectrum disorder. So think about that for a moment. So the LIS really do acknowledge that. And the way that they acknowledge that is on the sustainability of informal supports. So what do those words mean? Sustainability means that it is tricky. Informal supports are friends and family. And so the NDIS really does have a bit of a thought process in what's reasonable to expect parents to do for their child up to a certain age, and then beyond that, what might be captured by funded supports. So really, ages 0 to 6, parents are expected to do a lot. By the time, so for instance, bathing and personal care is largely the responsibility of a parent. By the time an individual's 16, the NDIS start to acknowledge that, usually parents have stopped providing personal care for a teenager, certainly by the time an individual's 26, and they don't expect aging parents to be providing personal care for their 60-year-old adult child. So they do counter this. If you've got 2 children with autism, do you get double the funding? The answer is it's not quite that clear, but being able to speak to your daily life and what goes on in your house helps them to build that part of the plan, and then deductively fund reasonable and necessary funded supports to sustain informal supports. Because trust me, everybody costs a lot more once they're out of the family situation. I do have participants who are out of home care and much more expensive. So sustaining the family unit is actually it's not just a value thing to do, it's actually an economical thing. It's better economic reality to keep families together.
Great, thanks. And I remember one of the presentations you did with Randa, where you spoke about, people talk about the lack of consistency in plans. And I think the analogy that you made was that your plan is a combination of the requirement for formal supports, but informal supports. And that's the part that differs. So the end outcome is going to look different. So how do people hold back in their planning meeting about the level of informal supports? How do you manage that balance between formal and informal supports?
All right. So it's the story of the 3 Jacks. So my Jack is 15. He's got autism, and he's got another friend called Jack and another friend called Jack. There was a stage where almost every kid we knew with autism was called Jack. So my Jack lives with both parents, and his plan reflects the amount of support that we give. Then we've got another friend, Jack, whose parents are separated, and his plan reflects the fact that there's a bit of back and forth between those parents. There's some extra complexity in the way that his informal supports manifest in his life. Then we've got another dear friend, Jack, whose mum was widowed when he was 3, and her plan really acknowledges the fact that she's not a single parent, she's a solo parent. And you could sit there and say, these Jacks literally almost have identical diagnosis, but their lives are really different. And in some ways, even though I've got the Jack with the least funding, I actually like the fact that the NDIS acknowledged that the different families that surround the different Jacks need a different plan to help them to have an ordinary life. So yes, now that did prompt a question once when I said that. Somebody said, well, should my husband and I separate? And the answer is no, definitely not. It's not a way to get more funding. But you should be honest about the supports that you've got. One more point I would make about informal supports is that they can really change, even if all the characters remain the same. Yeah. As we get older, there may have been times in our life where grandparents were an invaluable source of support, but lots of us, as we get a bit older, that relationship can change, and some of us find ourselves actually looking after aging parents. Yeah. So, as those plans evolve, being able to just speak to that so that the planner can understand exactly what's going on and where supports might come into.
Great. So informal supports are really important, and really the bottom line is that is often the reason for the inconsistency in plan values. I've got a question for Randa now. This is another parent who's asked this question. So the parent says, how do we word our goals so that our child has a support worker for community access and independent skills? So given that Richard's probably at that stage where he probably wants to participate in the community and have independent living skills, what is your advice?
Well, again, I use the NDIS Speak and tie it in with the goals. I'll just read out to you the wording we used, and we speak as if Richard is writing this. I would like support to source and skill develop to be in supported employment through allied health professionals and individual daily skill development. This will allow me to be financially independent so I can move out of home. Now, they're his goals, and that gives us access to allied health and gives us access to support workers, because what we're doing is tying it into his goal of achieving employment. That's his immediate goal, and then his long-term goal of moving out of home. Now, in order to move out of home, he needs to learn how to navigate the public transport system, how to go shopping, how to cook. So that gives you scope to employ different types of services. So again, the key is using their terminology and tying it into their goals. Also, remember, the great thing about the NDIS is it has shifted the power to the person with the disability or the carer. Previously, we had to literally go and beg for services. Please take my child, fill out the paperwork, fill out the application form, and every year you would fill out the same paperwork and cross your fingers and hope to God that they would take your child on. This has reversed that entirely. In fact, I was on the phone yesterday with our service providers, stating to them that now I would like to have a meeting, discuss outcomes, particularly with his social groups. He would meet the social groups, and I use the word groups plural because it wasn't just one organisation, they all did this. They meet, they get herded onto a bus or onto a train. As a group, they travel somewhere, they go and have lunch somewhere, and as a group, they get herded back onto the train and back, and then they make their way home. That's not good enough. Now I've asked for outcomes. Are they teaching him to use the train system? Are they expecting him to go and get his lunch independently? Are they expecting him to create social connections while being herded around? And this may sound harsh, but if I have to make a decision where to put the dollars that I've been allocated to achieve his goals, I want outcomes. In fact, I need outcomes to justify requesting these services again for my next plan. So it's shifted the power entirely. So use the terminology to support your goals. And remember, when you're engaging services, you hold the power.
Right. That's really valuable. I think some people actually forget that they do have choice. And I mean, in terms of MyCareSpace, what we try and do is demonstrate just how vast that choice is. And yes, it's not necessarily always easy to make that choice, but get connected. Have a support group around you. Speak to people like Randa. Reach out to a peer support group, because at the end of the day, you need to demand the service that you believe you're entitled to. Now, we're all paying good taxpayer money for the NDIS. If you're not getting any outcomes, and it sounds like in this instance, it's really not good enough. Your child, and you're entitled to say, well, what social outcomes are we getting, or what independent skills is he learning? So have you had any feedback?
Well, they're putting together a document, and it's as simple as when they offer cooking classes. Previously, they were taught to make gnocchi. I don't expect my son to go home and make gnocchi from scratch. I expect him to be able to function in a kitchen, whether he needs to defrost a meal or warm up a microwave meal, or scramble eggs, or make toast, or cook a really basic, just grill a chicken breast and make a salad. They're the outcomes I want. I don't want a gourmet cooking class. And I've made that really clear. and they've taken that on board.
Great, fantastic. So Randa, one more question for you from a parent in Victoria. How do I start putting it all together? What do I provide? Do I do a spreadsheet? Basically, I have no idea where to start. There's so much information out there. So that's more about, we're going to have Charmaine's useful links. That's great. But really for someone who's feeling overwhelmed, they know that there's the NDIS website, but how do they actually get started? And having gone through the process and successfully, what is your best advice? 2 or 3 kind of top tips for someone who's feeling overwhelmed.
Your top tips are make sure your reports are less than 2 years old. That's really important. The second one is there are workbooks available. The NDIS has a workbook available and various other support services or service providers have their own version. Now, these workshops, these workbooks are really, really useful. I filled them out, and as I filled them out, I thought, oh gosh, this is so repetitive. And they're literally asking you to document almost every hour of the day. In fact, I think the NDIS one breaks it down into 3 parts of the day: morning, afternoon, and evening. And what they're trying to gauge is how much support you as a carer have to give for basic tasks, such as waking up, personal care, such as showering, shaving, making breakfast, feeding. They want the nitty-gritty and don't think that any task is too minute or irrelevant to mention. We're so used to, as parents, thinking positively, trying to empower our child and trying to maintain a positive mindset. Now with this, you have to go in with a deficit model. As painful as that can be. So if you have to wake your child up every day, write that down. How many times do you have to rouse him? Write that down. Do you have to tell him what to do, how to get ready in the morning? Write down the details and write it down for every single day. It does get repetitive when you start from Monday and you're on Friday and you think, oh, as above, as above. No, don't write as above, just write, because I took that workbook in with me, and while in the planning meeting, they don't want papers. So if you hand that to them, they're not going to take it. But what that enabled me to do is read it out. Because when you're in that meeting, as well-intentioned and as well-prepared as you may be, you forget things. And this reminds you that, oh yes, he can't tie his shoelaces. Oh yes, I do have to put his Opal card in his wallet. Oh yes, I do have to walk him to the bus stop. Whatever situation that you're in, it reminds you to talk about every detail. So that's the best way to prepare. The documents, 2 years old, and fill out the workbook.
So don't expect it to be, thanks Randa, don't expect it to be an easy process. It will be emotionally draining if you've got to focus on all the negative issues, but it really is important. This planning, understanding, connecting with people who have been through the process, and find the support that you need, whether it's before or during the meeting. So that wraps up our planning for the NDIS, and with only 10 minutes or less than 10 minutes to go, nearly every single person asked the question about how do I get the most from my NDIS plan. Now, we could do a separate webinar just on that, and we potentially will, but for the moment, and for people who want to understand what are the resources out there. Charmaine, a lot of people ask things around, should I self-manage? Things, should I get support coordination? So can you just walk us through some of the top tips to get the most out of your plan?
Okay, so the first thing is, if you were going shopping at the shopping centre and you've only got $100 to spend, or if you've got $1,000 to spend, you're going to look at the prices so that you know how much is going to be when you get to the checkout. So I didn't realise it, but there is this price guide. Well, I didn't know at the start until I went to get 1 day of vacation care, and they said, that'll be $270. And I went, what? Like previously, vacation care had been like $30, but it was cross-subsidised by all these other things. And then this lovely woman said, dear, it's the price in the price guide. I was like, in the what guide? And so she actually gave me her copy of the price guide. In those days it was 90 pages long. Now it's just 50 pages. But I've given you the link to both the price guides, and they're different in different states. It's like the Eastern Seaboard and then the rest. And also the link to the assistive technology price guide, because that's one that we're probably not going to have a lot of time to cover today, but there's a price guide. You can have a look to see what things cost and how far your budget might go. But you really touched on perhaps one of the significant points that influence how you can get the most out of your plan, and that is how your funds are managed. And there's essentially 4 choices. The first one is you self-manage. Both Randa and I self-managed. We'll sing its praises till the cows come home. We'll come back to that. The next one is your agency managed. That means that the NDIA keep the funds. You're quite restricted to only use registered providers of supports, and they claim directly off the portal. There's nothing wrong with it, but you don't get the most amount of choice and control or innovation or flexibility. Then you can be plan managed. That opens up the opportunity to use non-registered providers of support, and the money to pay the plan manager is included on top. So you don't have to pay to be plan managed. It just gives you more options. And the fourth option is some kind of combination of that. So you could self-manage your core supports, and we haven't touched on that, but it's in my notes, the different categories that funding can fall into. And you might just decide that your therapies budget, which would come under improved daily living, there's all these code words and they correspond with support categories. And as you said, I could and would talk about it all day if you let me, but I won't. So how you manage your funds then determine how you can engage supports. And you can, if you're agency managed, then the only way that you can engage supports is to use registered providers of support. Right. And they're typically going to be your old style disability service providers. There's a few innovators coming up, but pretty much. If you self-manage, then you could choose to use independent contractors, or you could choose to directly engage supports. And the last thing I'm going to just touch on is innovation. So there are innovative service providers that have popped up. You know, if the NDIS stands for National Disability Insurance Scheme, but really it stands for change. And actually, right now, it's disruption. So if you feel anxious about it, it's because this is disruption, but it's for the best. This change is going to create a better future for our kids. Make no mistake, I believe that with all my heart. So the innovators that are popping up are things like, you might have heard of them, Higher Up, Better Caring, Care Seekers, Home Heroes. There's a whole range of them that are just making it easier to engage the supports. But perhaps the one that we might have come back to, which is choosing to be a self-manager. I was really daunted. The only reason why I did was because I went and saw another person talking about self-management, and I thought, if she can do it, maybe I can do it. And that was the catalyst for me going, I'll do it. It's been the best thing we ever did. So anyway, I thought, Randa, you might talk a little bit about being a self.
Yeah, Randa, we've got 4 minutes to go. So I know, Randa, one of the things you said was that maybe employing someone directly yourself. In 2 minutes, do you want to give us your experience there and how that's helped you get the most out of Richard's plan?
Well, for daily living skills, we are in the process of employing our own people. That way, we don't even have to refer to the price guide because a lot of people complain about the prices that are being charged. Well, there's no point complaining because this is what they are allowed to charge and they will charge that. So that's the going rate. Now, when you employ someone directly, you can negotiate your own rate, still offering a fair return. But what you're not doing is paying providers and layers. So you're bypassing 1 or 2 middlemen and paying the support worker directly. That's why it's more reasonable. So that's appealing to us. It stretches the funds further. And so by self-managing, employing some people directly, asking for outcomes, you really do stretch the dollar further.
Great. So, I mean, we've only got 2 minutes to go now. And I mean, in terms of getting the most out of one's plan, I think it's pretty obvious. You should consider to self-manage. There are other options. find out what they are, understand what skills and resources do you need to self-manage. Maybe you can do a combination if you're afraid of going straight to self-managing. As Charmaine said, get the NDIS price guide, keep it in your handbag, keep it in your wallet, and make sure you know what it's all about, because once you know what a unit of physiotherapy costs or a unit of occupational therapy, you can then start working backwards as to how many you can actually fit into your plan. Look at innovative ways of engaging people. As Randa said, you can employ people directly and you should consider it. In that way, you have more choice and control. I have to say, MyCareSpace is really about demonstrating to people just how much choice they have. We seek peer reviews of providers so that you can see what your peers think of different providers. So unfortunately, we've now run out of time, but I would like to say a huge thank you to Randa, who's here with me in Sydney, and Charmaine for being so enthusiastic, for giving generously of your time and your insights. Huge thank you. A lot of the information will be on the MyCareSpace website. All Charmaine's useful links will be emailed to everyone. Please go on to www.mycarespace.com.au and join up Randa's Facebook group. All of this will be shared generously on our forums. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.